40,000 years ago, deep inside a cave, a figure crouches in the dark. The only light comes from a small fire. It flickers. It dances on the stone walls. The figure picks up a hollow bone, presses one hand flat against the cold rock, and blows. A cloud of red dust bursts forward. When the hand pulls away, a perfect print is left behind on the wall. Then another, and another. Not pictures of animals, not maps, just hands, dozens of them, reaching out from the darkness toward us across 40,000 years. And here is the question that should stop you cold. This person was fighting every single day just to stay alive. There were predators outside. There was hunger. There was cold. Every hour mattered. Every resource counted. So why would they stop? Why would any of them stop to press their hand against a wall and blow red powder through a bone? Why did leaving that mark matter so much? Science has always told us a clean, simple story about early humans. They hunted. They ate. They survived. That was the whole job. But all over the world, in caves, in cliffs, under frozen ground, researchers keep finding things that don't fit that story. Tools made far more carefully than they needed to be. Dead bodies buried with flowers and paint and care. Art that looks like it came from someone who felt something, someone who needed to say something. The more scientists dig, the more uncomfortable the question gets. What if early humans weren't just surviving? What if they were doing something else, something deeper that we still don't fully understand? What if the answer changes everything we think we know about who we are? That's exactly what we're going to find out. On the southern tip of Africa, right where the land meets the ocean, there is a cave carved into a cliff. It is called Blombos Cave. The waves crash below it. The wind comes in hard off the water. And inside this cave, buried under layers of sand and ash and time, scientists found something small, something easy to miss, something that changed the conversation completely. It was a piece of ochre. Ochre is a type of soft rock that comes in shades of red and orange and brown. This particular piece was no bigger than your thumb. You could close your fingers around it and it would disappear inside your hand. But when researchers looked closely at its surface, they saw something that made them stop. Cut into the flat face of the rock were lines, careful, deliberate lines, crossing over each other in a neat geometric pattern. A crosshatch, precise, repeated, intentional. This piece of ochre was 75,000 years old. At first, scientists were cautious. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe the marks were made while the rock was being used for something else. It would be easier, after all, if it meant nothing. But then they found more pieces, more marks, same patterns. And then the real discovery came, not just the marked ochre, but an entire workspace built around it. In the same cave, researchers uncovered grinding stones worn smooth from use, small bowls made from shells, still stained with color inside, bones used as tools to mix and scrape. Everything needed to produce ochre pigment on purpose, in large amounts, over and over again. This wasn't an accident. This was a system. These people weren't just picking up a colored rock and playing with it. They were manufacturing something. They had a process. They came back to it. They refined it. And this was happening 75,000 years ago, roughly 35,000 years before the famous cave paintings in France and Spain that we usually call the beginning of human art. Let that sink in for a moment. Everything most of us learned in school pointed to Europe as the birthplace of symbolic human thought. The horse painted on cave walls in Lascaux, the bison, the handprints. That, we were told, was when humans first became creative, first became aware. But Blombos Cave quietly moved that date back by tens of thousands of years and moved the location to Africa. So now, the question gets harder. If this ochre work was just decoration, just meaningless pattern making to pass the time, why was it so organized? Why the workshops? Why the consistent geometric shapes? Why the effort? You don't build a production system for something that doesn't matter to you. Something mattered to these people. Something drove them to grind that rock, mix that color, and mark that surface again and again. The question is what? When scientists looked at the Blombos ochre and asked what it meant, they couldn't agree. And that disagreement, loud, ongoing, and unresolved, tells us just as much as the ochre itself. One group of researchers looked at those crosshatch lines and saw language, not language made of words, but language made of shapes, symbols with meaning, a way of storing information outside the human brain for the very first time. Archaeologist Francesco D'Erico, one of the most respected voices in this field, argued that these geometric marks were the earliest known example of symbolic thinking, that the people who made them were encoding something, a message, a system, maybe a way of saying, this belongs to me, or this means that, or remember this. In other words, the first steps toward everything: writing, numbers, record keeping, civilization itself. But another group pushed back hard. They said, the marks prove nothing of the sort. Humans make patterns naturally. We doodle, we scratch, we repeat shapes without any deep meaning behind them. These researchers argued that the ochre lines were the Stone Age version of drawing circles in the margin of your notebook, something the hands do when the mind is busy with something else. Satisfying, maybe, meaningful in the way that any repeated action becomes familiar, but not a symbol, not a message, just noise. For a while, both sides had reasonable arguments. Then a third piece of evidence arrived, and it didn't fit either theory. Researchers began noticing something strange when they mapped geometric patterns found at ancient sites around the world. The same shapes kept showing up, not similar shapes, not shapes that could be explained by one culture copying another. The exact same patterns, grids, spirals, zigzags, nested curves appearing in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, in Australia. Cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans, separated by tens of thousands of years, all drawing the same things. How do you explain that? A neurobiologist at Stanford named Jack Cowan had an answer, and it came from inside the human brain. Cowan had been studying what happens to the visual system when the brain enters altered states: deep meditation, high fever, intense fasting, certain plants. What he found was that the brain, under these conditions, begins generating its own images from within, patterns produced by the nervous system itself, not by anything seen in the outside world. He called them phosphenes. And when he mapped those patterns, they matched grids, spirals, zigzags, nested curves. The shapes carved into the Blombos ochre weren't drawn from the world around these people. They were drawn from inside them, which means the art wasn't a picture of a landscape or an animal or a meal. It was something far more personal and far more unsettling. It was a map of a human mind pressed into stone 75,000 years ago. And that changes what we thought we were looking for. Let's slow down for a moment and think about what this actually means. If Jack Cowan and the researchers who followed his work are right, if those ancient geometric patterns were coming from inside the human nervous system, then the people who made them weren't drawing pictures of the world around them. They were drawing pictures of their own inner experience. They were reaching inside themselves, pulling something out, and pressing it into stone so it would last. That is not the behavior of a creature that is simply surviving. That is the behavior of a creature that has an inside, a rich, complex, overwhelming inner world that it feels the need to express, to share, to preserve. For a long time, the standard story was that this kind of inner life developed slowly, that early humans were mostly animal-like, and over hundreds of thousands of years, piece by piece, the mind built itself up. First basic tools, then fire, then language, then art, then thought. A long, gradual climb toward the kind of awareness that you and I take for granted every morning when we wake up and immediately start thinking, feeling, worrying, wondering. But Blombos Cave, and the research that grew out of it, points to something very different. If symbolic thinking was already fully operating 75,000 years ago, organized, intentional, connected to inner experience, then the big pieces of human consciousness didn't arrive one at a time over millennia. They may have arrived together, all at once, in a burst so sudden and so complete that scientists who study this period have given it a name: the human revolution. The human revolution is one of the most debated events in all of science. At some point, and researchers argue constantly about exactly when something changed in the human brain, or in human society, or both. And after that change, humans stopped behaving like any other animal that had ever lived. They buried their dead with care. They made jewelry. They planned for seasons they hadn't lived through yet. They told stories. They asked questions about things they couldn't see or touch. No one knows exactly what triggered it. Some researchers think it was a genetic change, a small mutation that rewired something deep in the brain. Others think it was a social change that once groups reached a certain size, language exploded, and everything else followed. Others think it wasn't a single moment at all, but that the evidence of earlier moments has simply been lost to time. What they do agree on is this: by 75,000 years ago, it had already happened. These weren't early versions of humans slowly becoming aware. They were already aware fully, deeply, in ways that clearly overwhelmed them sometimes. Aware enough that they needed to take what lived inside their minds and put it somewhere outside themselves. Aware enough that silence wasn't enough. They needed to leave a mark. Here is where everything we thought we knew starts to crack. For decades, the story was simple and satisfying: human beings, real, thinking, conscious human beings, came into their own somewhere around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago in Europe. That was the moment the textbooks said when our ancestors truly woke up. They moved into Europe, spread across the land, and almost immediately began producing extraordinary things: painted caves, carved figurines, musical instruments made from bone. The archaeological record in Europe from that period is rich and dramatic and hard to argue with. Scientists called it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. And for a long time, it felt like a clean answer to a messy question. This was the moment. This was the place. Before it, primitive. After it, human. There was also a darker side to this story. When modern humans moved into Europe, the Neanderthals, the thick-boned, heavy-browed people who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years, disappeared. And the easy conclusion was obvious. Our ancestors arrived with their superior minds, their art, their language, their symbols. The Neanderthals had none of that. They were left behind. They died out. And we moved forward, the only species on Earth capable of true thought. It was a tidy story. It was also wrong. Blombos cave already pushed symbolic behavior back to 75,000 years ago and placed it in Africa, not Europe, among people who never set foot on the European continent. That alone should have been enough to rewrite the textbooks. But then in 2018, a team of researchers published results that hit the whole theory like a hammer. They had been carefully redating cave art found in Spain. Using a more precise dating method, they went back to paintings that had always been assumed to be the work of modern humans, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens. And the new dates came back older than expected. Much older. Old enough that Homo sapiens hadn't even arrived in that part of Europe yet when the art was made. The artist was a Neanderthal. Let that settle for a moment. The species we had written off as too primitive for symbolic thought. The species whose extinction we had quietly used as proof of our own superiority had been painting on cave walls, making marks, choosing colors, deciding what mattered enough to preserve. The story of human consciousness as a gift that belonged only to us, only to Homo sapiens, only to this one special branch of the evolutionary tree. That story does not survive this discovery. It means consciousness, or something very close to it, was not our invention. It was not our exclusive property. Other minds in other bodies, shaped differently than ours, were also reaching toward something. Also trying to say, I was here. Also refusing to disappear without a mark. If the Neanderthal painting shook the foundation, what comes next takes the whole building down. Because once you accept that symbolic behavior wasn't exclusive to modern humans, a natural question follows. How far back does it actually go? If Neanderthals were making art, what were the species before them doing? What were the creatures that came even earlier, the ones we have always placed firmly on the animal side of the line? The answer, it turns out, is deeply uncomfortable. In 2014, researchers examining a collection of shells found on the island of Java in Indonesia made a quiet but stunning announcement. One of those shells, a freshwater mussel pulled from the ground at a site called Trinil, had something on its surface. Engraved into it carefully and deliberately were geometric lines, a zigzag pattern cut with a sharp tool running cleanly across the shell's flat face. The shell was at least 430,000 years old, and it was not made by Homo sapiens. It was not made by a Neanderthal. It was made by Homo erectus, a species that most textbooks had placed well below the threshold of symbolic thought. A species we had long described as a smarter-than-average animal, capable of tools and fire, but not of meaning, not of intention, not of the kind of inner life that makes you pick up a shell and decide to carve a pattern into it for no practical reason whatsoever. That description no longer holds. And there is Zambia. Deep in the earth at a place called Broken Hill, miners uncovered bones and tools stained with ochre. The same red pigment used at Blombos cave, the same material that keeps appearing wherever ancient humans gathered. The age of these finds points to somewhere around 300,000 years ago, which means that the deliberate use of color, chosen, prepared, and applied, was happening before our own species, Homo sapiens, even existed as a distinct group on this planet. And then, just recently, in 2023, a team working in a South African cave made an announcement that stopped many researchers mid-sentence. They had found what appears to be the oldest known constructed bed in human history. Not a natural hollow, not an accidental resting place, a deliberate structure. Layers of grass and leaves gathered and arranged into a sleeping platform, built 200,000 years ago, older than modern humans as a species. Think about what that requires. You have to understand comfort. You have to imagine a better night's sleep and then take steps to create it. You have to care about your own rest, your own body, your own tomorrow. That is not pure survival instinct. That is something closer to self-regard. A sense that your experience of life, how it feels to lie down at the end of a hard day, actually matters. These beings weren't just moving through the world. They were arranging it around themselves. Imagine her. She is about 30 years old. By the standards of 300,000 BCE, that is not young. That is a life already long and hard and full. She has buried 2 of her children. She has walked across distances that would take a modern person weeks to cover by foot, carrying everything she owns, moving with her group through landscapes that had no names yet. She has been cold enough to shake and hungry enough that sleep wouldn't come. She has watched people she loved simply not wake up one morning, and yet here she is, still moving. Still here. Tonight, before she lies down, she does something. She gathers grass, fresh grass, the kind that still smells green, and she layers it on the ground in a particular way. She presses it down, adjusts it, adds more along the edges. She has done this before. She knows how thick it needs to be to keep the cold from coming up through the earth. She knows which direction to face. She pulls the bundle close around her and settles into it. Outside the cave, something screams in the dark, a long, sharp sound that cuts through the night air and then stops. She hears it. Her body knows what it means, but she doesn't run. She has made this place. The smell of the grass is familiar. The shape of the space fits her body. This is not just a spot on the ground. It is somewhere she has chosen, prepared, and returned to. And there is a difference between those two things that matters more than it might seem. Somewhere inside her skull, inside a brain that measures 1,400 cubic centimeters, which is exactly the same size as yours, something shifts. The tight wire of alertness loosens, just slightly. Her breathing slows. The sounds outside are still there, but they are outside, and she is here in the place she made, surrounded by the smell she knows. Whatever that feeling is, that loosening, that settling, that quiet sense of being held by something familiar, it moves through her like warmth spreading from the chest outward. We would call it comfort. We don't know what she called it. We don't know if she called it anything at all, but it was real. It happened in a real brain, in a real body, on a real night that was cold and dark and full of danger. She was not a symbol. She was not a data point in a scientific paper. She was a person who had lost children and kept walking. A person who, at the end of a day that we cannot fully imagine, wanted to feel safe, wanted to rest, wanted to be, for a few hours, somewhere that felt like hers. She closed her eyes. And 300,000 years later, you do the same thing. Think about last night. At some point before you fell asleep, you adjusted something. Maybe you fluffed a pillow and turned it to the cooler side. Maybe you pulled a blanket up to a specific position, the one that feels right and not quite right any other way. Maybe you checked that the door was locked or turned a lamp off or moved your phone to a particular spot on the nightstand. Small things. Automatic things. Things you did without thinking because they are part of how you make a space feel like yours before you close your eyes. She would recognize every single one of those gestures. Now think about the objects around you that have no practical purpose. A photograph you've moved from one home to the next without ever really deciding to keep it. You just couldn't put it in the box marked for throwing away. A book with a broken spine and pencil marks in the margins that belongs to someone who isn't around anymore. A piece of jewelry you don't wear but also don't remove from the drawer because getting rid of it feels like losing something a second time. These objects do nothing. They cannot protect you or feed you or keep you warm, and yet you carry them through your life as if they have weight that matters. That is the same impulse that ground ochre into powder and pressed a hand against cold stone. Think about the marks you make, the text you send at night when something hits you and you need someone else to know it happened. The photo you post not because anyone asked, but because the light was doing something beautiful and you needed to capture it before it was gone. The journal entry written at 1 in the morning that no one will ever read, that starts with the words "I don't know how to explain this but," and then tries anyway. None of that is survival. All of it is the same reaching that carved geometric lines into a shell 430,000 years ago. The gap between you and her is not the gap between a primitive creature and a modern one. It is not the gap between animal and human, between unaware and aware, between empty and full. That gap does not exist in the way we were taught. The real gap is circumstance. Her dangers had teeth and moved through the grass at night. Yours send emails and live in your chest and wake you up at 3 in the morning with a specific kind of dread that has no name. Her grief was immediate and physical. Bodies that went cold, people who simply weren't there anymore. Yours is slower and stranger, and sometimes harder to explain to anyone, including yourself. But the mind carrying all of it, the mind that hurts and wonders and reaches and needs to leave a mark before it disappears. That mind is the same mind. It has always been the same mind. Here is what the evidence keeps saying, quietly, from every site and every discovery and every small object pulled out of the earth after thousands of centuries underground. Consciousness. Real consciousness. The kind that feels things deeply and asks questions it can't answer and needs to leave some kind of mark before it's gone, is older than we wanted to believe, stranger than our categories allow, and far more widespread than the story we told ourselves about being the one special species that truly woke up. It didn't arrive with civilization. The cities and the writing and the calendars and the laws, those came much later, built on top of something that was already fully present and already burning. It didn't arrive with language because the marks came before the words we can trace, and something had to drive the marking before language gave it a name. It may not have arrived at all, at any single moment we can point to and say, there, that is when the lights came on. It may have always been there, burning quietly, in bodies shaped differently than ours. In minds we drew clean lines around and placed below us on a chart, because it was easier that way. Because if consciousness belonged only to us, then we were special in a way that meant something. Protected, chosen, distinct from everything else that has ever lived and breathed and eventually gone still. But the shells and the caves and the ochre and the carefully layered grass do not support that story. They support a different one, a harder one. One that asks us to look at the long line of creatures that came before us and consider the possibility that awareness, the raw fact of experiencing your own life from the inside, was not the prize waiting at the end of a long evolutionary race. Maybe it was the engine running underneath the whole thing from the beginning. And if that is true, then the most important question is not the one scientists have been arguing about for decades. Not when did humans become conscious. Not which species crossed the line first. Not where and not how. The question is this: what has consciousness been trying to do this whole time? What is it reaching for, across every era and every species and every dark cave where someone stopped surviving for a moment and started expressing instead? What is it trying to say, with every mark and every buried body and every object kept for no reason except that throwing it away felt unbearable? We don't know. Not yet. maybe not ever. But somewhere, on the walls of caves that tourists now visit on guided tours, the handprints are still there, red against stone, clear as the day they were made. Dozens of hands pressing out of the darkness toward whoever might be passing through. They have been waiting 40,000 years for someone to press their hand back. Maybe that someone is you.